Smoke blanketed the neighborhood like a ghost, consuming everything in its path. Max crouched under the dining table. The flames' heat unbearable. His owner's voice had vanished, replaced by deafening silence. When the firefighters finally pulled him from the wreckage, he didn't resist. He couldn't. Weeks later, James Reynolds stood in the shelter's doorway, his boots planted on cold concrete. The faint barks of dogs echoed down the hall, but his focus was elsewhere, on the weight pressing down on his chest. The military had trained him to face enemies, not emptiness. "You're not saving the world, James," Emma had said, "but maybe you can save one soul." James wasn't sure if he was ready. Then he saw Max. 2 survivors. 2 broken spirits. And 1 chance to heal. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey coming tomorrow. The air inside the shelter was thick with the mingling scents of disinfectant and wet fur. James Reynolds paused in the doorway, his boots planted firmly on the cold concrete floor. For a moment, he considered turning back. His heartbeat thrummed in his ears, his pulse quickened by the faint echoes of barking dogs down the hall. He rubbed the worn leather of his Jameset sleeve between his fingers, a nervous habit that had followed him out of the service. He wasn't sure if this was a good idea, or if it would even help. But Emma's words echoed in his mind, *, you need something to ground you, James. Someone who needs you just as much as you need them. James exhaled heavily, shifting his weight as a shelter staff member. A petite woman with warm eyes and a clipboard approached him. "Mr. Reynolds," she asked, her voice tinged with gentle concern. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, his voice gravelly from disuse. "I'm Sarah. Thanks for coming in. Let me show you around," she said, gesturing down a long corridor. James nodded and followed, his boots echoing softly with each step. The shelter was modest but well kept. Metal kennels lined the walls, each housing a dog, some wagging their tails eagerly, others pacing nervously or lying curled up in the corners of their cages. James kept his eyes forward, trying not to dwell on their pleading stares. He knew what desperation looked like, and seeing it in these dogs brought an unwelcome tightness to his chest. Sarah spoke as they walked. "We have all kinds here, young, old, big, small. Most of them come from tough situations. Abandonment, abuse, even disasters." She paused, her tone softening. "One of the dogs you'll meet today, Max, was surrendered after surviving the Los Angeles fires earlier this year. He's had a rough go of it." The mention of the fires made James's throat tighten. He'd seen the news, whole neighborhoods swallowed in flames, lives upended in an instant. He nodded but said nothing, his mind already spinning. They reached a corner of the shelter where the barking seemed to subside. Sarah led him to a kennel near the end of the row. Inside, a large German shepherd lay curled on the floor, his back to the bars. His coat was dull, and his body looked leaner than it should have. He didn't move as they approached, not even when Sarah crouched and called his name. "Max," she said softly. The dog's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't turn around. Sarah glanced back at James with a small, apologetic smile. "He's been like this for a while. He's not aggressive, just withdrawn." James crouched down beside her, his knees cracking audibly. He studied Max through the bars, taking in the slope of his shoulders and the way his tail remained motionless against the floor. A pang of recognition struck James's chest, though he couldn't place why. Something about the dog's posture, the defeated way he lay there, reminded him of a soldier in retreat, a soul burdened by too much. "What happened to him?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated. "His owner didn't make it. The fires hit their neighborhood hard. Max was found wandering nearby, covered in ash and severely dehydrated. He's been here ever since." James felt his jaw tighten. He couldn't shake the image of Max wandering through a burned-out street, searching for a master who would never call him home again. He'd seen too many scenes like that during his tours overseas, displaced people, lost and searching for something familiar in the chaos. Slowly, James reached out, resting his hand against the bars. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "It's okay. You're safe now." Max didn't respond. His ears twitched again, but his head remained turned away. James's hand dropped back to his knee, his heart sinking. He hadn't expected an immediate connection, but the indifference cut deeper than he thought it would. Sarah stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "Max hasn't bonded with anyone here. We've tried. But some dogs just shut down after trauma. It's hard to reach them." James remained crouched, his eyes fixed on the unmoving dog. He thought of Emma's words again, the plea in her voice when she told him to try this, to find something or someone to anchor him. He thought of his own restless nights, the memories that wouldn't let him go, the weight of the past pressing down on his chest. "I'll take him," James said suddenly, his voice firmer than he expected. Sarah blinked. "Are you sure? He's not an easy case." "I'm sure," James said, rising to his feet. His knees ached in protest, but he ignored them. "We've all got our scars, right?" He looked down at Max again, something resolute settling in his gaze. "We'll figure it out." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. Let's get the paperwork started." As she led him back toward the front desk, James glanced over his shoulder at Max one last time. The dog hadn't moved, but James thought he saw the faintest flicker of light in his dark eyes, a spark, buried deep, that hadn't been fully extinguished. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to hold on to. James followed Sarah, his stride a little more purposeful now. He didn't know if this would work, or if Max would ever trust him, but he was willing to try. Because for the first time in a long time, James felt something stir within him, a quiet determination, a fragile but persistent hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. James sat at the shelter's front desk, the pen hovering over the adoption forms. His hand trembled slightly, and he tightened his grip to steady it. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like an invisible force, leaving a tight knot in his chest. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above filled the silence as he stared at the paper, the bold letters of Max's name etched in black ink at the top of the form. "You don't have to rush," Sarah said gently, breaking the stillness. She stood behind the counter, her expression a careful mix of encouragement and concern. "It's okay to think it over. Max, he's not going anywhere." James nodded, but his eyes stayed on the form. "I've made bigger decisions faster than this," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration, not at Sarah, but at himself. It wasn't like him to second guess. He'd made life or death calls under fire without hesitation. But this felt different. Bigger decisions. "Sure," Sarah said, leaning her elbows on the counter, "but not necessarily harder ones. Max is a challenge. James, you saw him. He's complicated." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes these cases don't work out the way we hope." James's jaw tightened, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "You're saying I shouldn't take him?" "Not at all," Sarah replied quickly. "I'm just saying it's okay if you're not ready. Max needs a lot of patience. He's been through hell, and he'll need someone who's willing to meet him where he is, no matter how long it takes." She paused, her voice softening. "That's not an easy thing to take on, especially if you're going through your own stuff." James leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He knew she had a point. The past few years had been a constant battle against nightmares, against the heavy stillness of his empty house, against the creeping sense of uselessness that had followed him since he'd left the military. But wasn't that exactly why he was here? To find something to pull him out of the spiral? "You don't think I can handle it," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I'm not saying that," Sarah insisted. "I just want to make sure you're ready for what this means. He's not like other dogs. He'll need more than food, walks, and a warm bed. He needs someone who can help him heal." James's lips pressed into a thin line as he thought about Max, the dog's lifeless eyes, The way he flinched at every sound, it was like looking into a mirror. He'd seen that same emptiness in his own reflection too many times to count. That's why he couldn't walk away. If he didn't try, who would? He's not just a dog, James said, his voice firmer now. He's a survivor. He's been through things most people can't even imagine. And he's still standing. That's worth something. Sarah smiled faintly. But there was still hesitation in her eyes. It is, she agreed. But the thing about survivors? They carry the weight of what they've been through. And that weight doesn't just disappear. It takes time. James. A lot of time. I've got time, James said. The words felt heavier than he intended. But they were true. Time was the one thing he had in abundance these days. Before Sarah could respond, the front door swung open, and Emma stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She spotted James immediately and made her way over, her brow furrowing when she saw the look on his face. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between James and Sarah. "Did you change your mind?" "Not yet," James said. "Just thinking it over." Emma folded her arms, her expression skeptical. "You've been thinking it over for months. Isn't that what brought you here in the first place?" She turned to Sarah. "Did you tell him he couldn't do it?" "No," Sarah said, her tone patient. "I just want to make sure he's ready." Emma rolled her eyes. "James is ready. He's been ready. He's just afraid to pull the trigger." "I'm not afraid," James said sharply, his voice carrying more bite than he intended. Emma raised an eyebrow, and he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Okay. Maybe I'm a little afraid." "Of what?" Emma pressed. "Of screwing it up," James admitted. "What if I take him home and I make things worse? What if I can't fix him?" "You're not supposed to fix him," Emma said gently. "You're supposed to be there for him. That's it. That's what he needs, someone who won't give up on him. And if anyone can do that, it's you." She placed a hand on his arm, her expression softening. "You've been through hell too, James. You know what it's like to need someone in your corner." James swallowed hard, her words hitting deeper than he cared to admit. He looked down at the form again, the pen still resting in his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he signed his name. Sarah took the form with a small nod. "All right," she said. "Let's get everything finalized." As Sarah walked away, Emma gave James a small smile. "You're doing the right thing." "I hope so," James said, his voice low. But as he thought of Max lying in that kennel, something inside him felt steadier. It wasn't certainty, but it was close enough. The ride home was tense, filled with silence except for the hum of the truck's engine. Max lay on the blanket James had spread across the passenger seat, his body rigid and pressed against the door as far from James as he could manage. His head was low, eyes darting to every passing car and shadow. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing at Max occasionally, unsure if his presence was helping or making things worse. When they reached the house, James killed the engine and sat for a moment, watching Max. The dog didn't move, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. "All right, buddy," James said quietly, grabbing the leash from the dash. "Let's take it slow." James opened the truck door, the cool evening air rushing in. Max's ears twitched, but he stayed frozen. James looped the leash over his wrist and crouched down to coax him out. "Come on. It's okay. You're safe now." It took several minutes of gentle encouragement before Max tentatively stepped out of the truck, his movements stiff and wary. James led him toward the front door, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. Max's head swiveled constantly, his muscles tensed as though he were ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Inside, James had prepared a quiet space in the corner of the living room. A soft dog bed sat beside a water bowl, and a few toys lay scattered nearby. James hoped it would feel welcoming, but Max barely glanced at it. Instead, he pressed himself against the nearest wall, his body trembling. James's chest tightened as he watched. He'd known Max would be nervous, But seeing him like this, so broken, so fragile, was harder than he'd expected. "Take your time," James murmured, sitting down on the floor a few feet away. He didn't want to crowd him. Hours passed, and Max didn't budge from his spot. James tried not to stare, but it was hard not to feel helpless. He eventually made himself a sandwich in the kitchen, leaving the living room light dimmed. When he returned, Max was still there, his eyes following James's every move. "You're gonna have to eat something," James said, setting down a bowl of food near Max's corner. The dog didn't even sniff it. As night fell, James sat on the couch, the TV playing quietly in the background. He couldn't stop thinking about the shelter, about Sarah's words. Max needs someone who won't give up on him. But what if he wasn't enough? What if Max was too far gone? James glanced at the framed photo on the mantel, him in uniform, his arms slung around his old war dog. Max. The memory hit like a punch to the gut. Max had been a rock during the worst of times, his unwavering loyalty keeping James steady when everything else felt like chaos. But Max was gone now. And Max was nothing like him. That thought lingered, heavy and bitter. As James drifted off to sleep on the couch, a loud crash jerked James awake. He shot up, his heart pounding. And for a split second, he thought he was back in the field. But the sight of his quiet living room pulled him back to reality. The crash had come from the kitchen. James hurried toward the noise, finding Max in the corner, his body low to the ground and his tail tucked. A shattered plate lay on the floor near him, fragments scattered like jagged puzzle pieces. Max's eyes were wide, and his chest heaved as though he'd been running. Hey, James said softly, raising his hands. "It's okay." Max flinched at the sound of James's voice, his body pressing tighter against the wall. James's gut twisted. He crouched down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "It's all right, buddy. It's just a plate. No big deal." He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, speaking in low, calm tones until Max's breathing began to slow. James reached out cautiously, but the dog recoiled, his ears flattening. James pulled back immediately, sighing. "We'll try again tomorrow," he muttered, carefully sweeping up the broken plate while keeping an eye on Max. The rest of the night was quiet, but the tension lingered. James lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought he was prepared for this, for the patience it would take, for the setbacks, but now he wasn't so sure. Every moment with Max felt like walking on eggshells, and the fear of doing something wrong loomed over him like a shadow. The next morning, James woke to find Max still curled in the corner of the living room. The food bowl sat untouched. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't working," he muttered to himself. He grabbed a cup of coffee and sat on the floor a few feet from Max. He didn't say anything at first, just sipped his coffee and stared out the window. The silence was heavy but not unbearable. Eventually, James spoke. "You know, I get it." Max's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but he didn't move. "I get what it's like to feel stuck, to not know who to trust, to carry things that no one else can see." James's voice was steady, but there was a rawness to it that surprised even him. "But you don't have to do this alone. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting James's. It was brief, just a flicker of connection, but it was enough to make James's chest tighten. "That's it," James said quietly, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. One step at a time. The day continued with small, careful attempts to engage Max. James moved the food bowl closer, keeping a respectful distance. By evening, Max finally ate a few bites, though he stayed on high alert. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As James sat on the couch that night, watching Max's chest rise and fall as he slept in his corner, he allowed himself a moment of hope. It wasn't going to be easy. He'd known that from the start. But seeing Max take that small step forward reminded him why he'd made the choice to try. James leaned back, closing his eyes. "We'll get there," he whispered. More to himself than to Max, "We'll figure it out together." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. James stood in the center of the living room, his hands clutching the familiar, weathered vest. The fabric was faded, patches of sand and dirt from 100 different places still embedded in the seams. He ran his fingers over the stitching, his mind wandering back to the countless days spent with Max's old war dog by his side. Now, he was pinning his hopes on this vest, sparking something in Max, something that could bridge the yawning gap between them. Max was curled up in his usual corner, his head resting on his paws, eyes flicking nervously around the room. The food bowl nearby was half empty, a minor victory James was trying not to overanalyze. At least Max had eaten. That was progress. "Hey, bud," James said softly, holding up the vest. "Recognize this?" His voice was calm, careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace they'd started to build. Max's ears twitched at the sound of James's voice, but he didn't lift his head. James crouched down slowly, the vest hanging loosely in his hands. "This used to mean something, didn't it? Used to be a part of you." He placed the vest on the floor between them, then retreated a few steps to give Max space. James sat cross-legged, his back against the wall, and waited. The minutes stretched, the only sounds in the room the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. James resisted the urge to speak again, knowing this was a moment for patience, not pressure. After what felt like an eternity, Max shifted. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, and his eyes flicked toward the vest. James held his breath, watching as Max hesitantly lifted his head. The dog's movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were testing the waters of a long-dormant memory. When Max finally stretched his neck toward the vest, James's heart leapt. The dog's nose brushed against the fabric, and he inhaled deeply, his ears perking slightly. For the first time since bringing him home, James saw a glimmer of curiosity in Max's expression. "That's it," James murmured, his voice barely audible. "You remember, don't you?" Max nudged the vest gently with his snout, then retreated back to his corner. It wasn't much, but it was something. James leaned his head back against the wall, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Small steps, he reminded himself. Small steps. The next day, James decided to introduce another piece of their shared past, a worn rubber ball he'd found buried in a box of old gear. It was scuffed and faded, the once bright yellow now a muted beige. But James hoped it might strike a chord with Max. "All right, let's see if this does anything," James said, crouching down in the middle of the living room. He rolled the ball across the floor toward Max, who was lying in his usual spot. The ball bumped against Max's paw and stopped. Max's head lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the object. James watched intently, his fingers drumming nervously against his knee. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "It's just a ball." Max sniffed the air cautiously, then leaned forward to inspect the ball. He nudged it with his nose, sending it rolling a few inches away. For a brief moment, James thought he saw a flicker of recognition, a hint of the playful dog Max might have been before the fires, before the trauma. But the moment was fleeting. Max lowered his head again, his body curling protectively into itself. James exhaled slowly, trying to mask his disappointment. "It's okay," he said softly. "We'll try again later." Over the next week, James continued to reintroduce familiar objects and routines. He placed the vest near Max's corner, leaving it there so the dog could approach it on his own terms. The ball became a fixture in their daily interactions, always within reach but never forced. Slowly, Max began to engage with these items more often, sniffing the vest, nudging the ball, and even carrying it in his mouth once before retreating to his corner. One afternoon, James decided to push things a little further. He'd been practicing the whistle command he'd used in the field, a sharp, distinct sound that once signaled Max to focus. Now, he stood in the yard, The whistle pressed to his lips and gave it a short, deliberate blow. Max, who had been lying in the grass a few feet away, perked up instantly. His ears stood tall, and his head snapped toward James. The response was so immediate, so instinctual, that James felt a lump rise in his throat. "Good boy," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling in his chest. "Come here." Max hesitated for a moment, his gaze darting between James and the ball lying nearby. Then, with cautious steps, he approached. James knelt down, holding the ball in his hand. "You want this?" he asked, rolling it gently toward Max. To James's astonishment, Max caught the ball with his paw, pinning it to the ground. He stared at it for a moment before picking it up in his mouth and trotting a few feet away. It wasn't quite a game of fetch, but it was the closest they'd come to play. James couldn't help but laugh, the sound startling both him and Max. "That's it, bud," James said, his smile widening. "You're starting to come back, aren't you?" That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat on the porch steps, watching Max explore the yard. The dog's movements were still cautious, his tail low but not tucked. He sniffed at the grass, occasionally glancing back at James as if seeking reassurance. James's thoughts drifted as he watched Max. The progress they'd made in such a short time felt fragile, like a thread that could snap at any moment. But it also felt real. For the first time since bringing Max home, James felt a spark of hope, a belief that they could get through this together. "You're stronger than you think," James said softly, as much to himself as to Max. "We both are." Max's ears twitched at the sound of James's voice. He turned, his eyes meeting James's for a moment before he padded over to sit beside him. James reached out slowly, his hand hovering near Max's head. When the dog didn't flinch, James let his fingers brush against the coarse fur behind Max's ears. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. James smiled, the warmth of it spreading through him like a bomb. "We're gonna be okay, Max," he murmured, "one step at a time." James leaned against the fence post in his backyard, the morning air crisp and quiet except for the occasional chirp of a bird. Max stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes scanning the open space as if expecting something to disrupt the peace. James held the familiar rubber ball in his hand, its surface worn smooth from years of use. Today, he was going to try again. "All right, buddy," James said, his voice calm but edged with hope. "Let's see what you've got." He tossed the ball gently, letting it arc through the air before landing a few yards away. Max's head turned toward it, his ears perking up slightly. James stayed still, his eyes fixed on the dog. Every muscle in his body was taut, as if his own stillness might coax Max into action. For a moment, Max didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, his paws tentative against the grass. "That's it," James murmured, barely above a whisper. Max stopped a foot away from the ball, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. He lowered his head cautiously, nudging the ball with his nose before pulling back. James's heart pounded. This was the closest Max had come to engaging since they'd started working together. But just as quickly as he'd approached, Max turned and retreated a few steps, his body tense and uncertain. James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It was progress, sure, but it wasn't the breakthrough he'd hoped for. As he bent down to pick up the ball, memories surfaced unbidden, like an old reel of film playing in his mind. He saw himself crouched in the dust of an arid base overseas, a younger version of himself calling out commands to another German shepherd. "Max, fetch," he'd shouted, his voice firm but tinged with pride. Max had darted across the terrain, his powerful legs kicking up clouds of sand as he retrieved the item James had thrown. The dog's tail had wagged furiously when he returned, dropping the object at James's feet with an eager bark. Max had been fearless, loyal to a fault. Thinking about him now was like pressing on a bruise, painful, but impossible to ignore. James exhaled slowly, shaking off the memory. "You're not Max," he said softly, almost to himself. "And that's okay." determined to keep trying. James adjusted his approach over the next few days. He set up short, structured sessions in the backyard, always keeping things low pressure. The ball was a constant, though James was careful not to force it. Instead, he focused on making Max comfortable, praising him for even the smallest steps forward. Sometimes that meant Max sniffing the ball without recoiling, other times it was simply Max lying down nearby, his body language more relaxed. One afternoon, James decided to bring out the whistle. It had been part of their earlier breakthroughs, and he hoped it might reignite something in Max standing a few yards away from the dog. James pressed the whistle to his lips and gave a sharp, clear blow. The sound cut through the air, crisp and commanding. Max's ears snapped up immediately, his head swiveling toward James. For a moment, his eyes held a glint of recognition, a spark of something buried deep. James's chest tightened. He blew the whistle again, this time holding the ball aloft. "Come on, Max," James said, his voice steady but laced with anticipation. "You've got this." Max hesitated, his body shifting as though caught between two instincts, to retreat or to move forward. Then, slowly, he began to approach. His steps were measured, cautious, but there was an unmistakable focus in his eyes now. James's heart hammered in his chest as Max stopped a foot away, his gaze locked on the ball. "Good boy," James murmured, lowering the ball to the ground. "Take it. It's yours." Max's nose twitched as he sniffed the ball, his tail giving a faint, hesitant wag. James didn't move. His breath held as Max leaned down and gently picked up the ball in his mouth. For a moment, they both stayed frozen, the significance of the moment hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Then Max turned and padded back toward James, the ball still clutched in his jaws. "Attaboy," James exclaimed, his voice breaking with emotion. When Max dropped the ball at James's feet, James crouched down, his hands trembling as he reached out. This time, Max didn't flinch. Instead, he nudged James's hand with his nose, his tail wagging slightly more. James let out a shaky laugh, a grin spreading across his face. "You remember," he said, his voice thick. "You finally remember." That night, James sat on the porch steps with Max lying beside him, the ball resting between them. The air was cool and still, the stars scattered across the sky like shards of glass. James leaned back, his hands braced against the wooden steps, and let his thoughts wander. He thought about the first time he'd met Max at the shelter, the defeated look in the dog's eyes. He thought about the countless moments of doubt, the nights he'd spent wondering if he was doing the right thing, if he was enough. But most of all, he thought about this moment, the quiet companionship of a dog who was finally starting to trust him. "You did good today, bud," James said, his voice soft but filled with pride. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Max's fur. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the moment. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace he thought was lost to him. It wasn't just about Max's progress, it was about their progress. Together, they were piecing something back together, something that had been broken in both of them. James looked down at Max, a small smile playing on his lips. "We're gonna be all right," he said quietly, the words more a promise than a statement. And for the first time, he believed it. The park was alive with the sounds of children's laughter and the distant barking of dogs. The grass was lush underfoot, shimmering faintly with morning dew, and the air carried the crisp promise of spring. James stood at the edge of the field, his hands resting in the pockets of his chain set, watching as Max bounded across the open space with the energy of a dog half his age. The sight filled James with a quiet, contented pride, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Max stopped abruptly, his ears perking up as he located the ball James had just thrown. With a powerful leap, he lunged forward, snatching it from the air before trotting back to James, his tail wagging triumphantly. James crouched down, scratching behind Max's ears as he dropped the ball at his feet. "Good boy," James said, his voice warm. "You're really getting the hang of this again." Huh. Max let out a soft woof, his eyes shining with a playfulness James hadn't seen since their time overseas. It was moments like these that reminded James why he'd made the choice to bring Max home. It hadn't been easy, but every challenge, every setback, had been worth it. As James straightened, he noticed a figure approaching from across the park. A younger man, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, walked toward them with a Labrador at his side. The dog's sleek coat gleamed in the sunlight, but its posture was tense, its movements hesitant. "Hey there," the man called out, raising a hand in greeting. "Morning," James replied, offering a nod. He could see the uncertainty in the man's eyes as he approached. The same look James had worn during his early days with Max. "You've got a good-looking dog," the man said, stopping a few feet away. He gestured to Max, who was now sitting calmly by James's side. "Thanks. This is Max," James said. "What's your boy's name?" "This is Duke," the man replied, glancing down at the Labrador. "He's still a work in progress." James nodded knowingly. "Takes time," he said, "but it's worth it." The man hesitated, then let out a sigh. "Honestly, I'm not sure I'm doing this right. Duke's a rescue. Came from a rough situation, and he's got a lot of anxiety. I've tried everything, but I don't know if he'll ever really trust me." James's gaze softened as he looked at Duke, who was standing stiffly beside his owner, his tail held low. "I know how that feels," James said. "Max was in a bad place when I first brought him home. He'd been through a lot, and it took a while for him to come around." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of hope breaking through his doubt. "How'd you do it?" he asked. James crouched down beside Max, who leaned into his touch. "Patience," he said simply. "And consistency. Dogs like Max and Duke, they need to know they can count on you. That you're not going to give up on them, no matter how hard it gets." The man nodded slowly, as though weighing James's words. "It's just, some days it feels like I'm not getting anywhere," he admitted. James smiled faintly. "I get that. There were nights I sat on the floor with Max wondering if I'd made a mistake. But every small victory, every time he took a step toward trusting me, made it worth it." He paused, glancing down at Duke. "And I can tell Duke's got a good heart. He just needs you to show him the way." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he gave a small nod. "Thanks. That means a lot." "Anytime," James said, standing up. "If you ever want to talk, or need some tips, we're usually here in the mornings." "I'll take you up on that," the man said, a hint of a smile breaking through. "Come on, Duke. Let's give it another shot." As the man and Duke walked away, James watched them for a moment, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. He reached down, giving Max a pat on the head. "You're paying it forward, bud," he said. That evening, James and Max returned home, the sun dipping low on the horizon and casting the house in warm, golden light. James opened the door, and Max trotted inside, his tail wagging lightly. The house, once quiet and empty, now felt alive with Max's presence. James couldn't imagine it any other way. After dinner, James settled onto the couch with a cup of coffee, watching as Max curled up on his bed near the fireplace. The flickering light danced across the room, casting long shadows that felt more comforting than eerie. James let his gaze linger on Max, marveling at how far they'd come. In his mind, he replayed the moment Max had first fetched the ball, the way his tail had wagged as he carried it back. That memory was etched into James's heart, a reminder of the resilience they'd both found in each other. James reached for the photo on the coffee table, the one of him and Max from years ago. He studied it for a moment, then placed it back down, his fingers brushing against the frame. "Thanks for everything, Max," he said quietly. "You'd like Max. He's got your spirit." As the night wore on, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. He'd started this journey hoping to help Max, but in many ways, Max had helped him even more. Together, they'd found a way to heal, to move forward, and to build something new from the pieces of their past. When James finally turned out the lights and headed to bed, Max followed, his paws clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The dog settled at the foot of the bed, his presence a steady, reassuring weight. James lay there in the dark, a faint smile on his lips. "We're a good team. You and me," he murmured. And as Max let out a contented sigh, James knew they'd both found exactly what they needed, a second chance. The next morning, the park was just as lively, the sun casting a warm glow over the bustling field. James and Max walked their usual path, the ball tucked under James's arm. They passed Duke and his owner, the two of them working on a game of fetch. James gave the man a thumbs up, and the smile he received in return was all the encouragement he needed. As Max ran ahead, free and unburdened, James paused to take in the scene. The park, the people, the dogs, it all felt like a part of something bigger, something worth holding on to. And in that moment, with the sun on his face and Max by his side, James felt whole again.
James watched Max running free in the park, his tail wagging, his spirit alive again. They had healed together. Have you ever experienced a bond that changed your life? Share your thoughts in this story with others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.